Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into a hot topic that is sure to stir up some debate among developers and project managers alike: story points. You certainly heard of those. Maybe you're still using them in your work. In this video I'll explain to you why I don't use story points in my project at all. Never. Story points, t-shirt sizes, or any similar schemes are at best wasteful and more likely harmful. I'll show you several examples of the harm that can be done by story point estimations. But still, the hardest part is to stop using story points or prevent someone else from trying to introduce them. You need something else to replace them with, and you need a solid argumentation against them. Keep watching to find out all the arguments against story points, so you don't have to suffer from them ever again. Tracking down the history of story points is really difficult. A lot of people usually point towards Scrum being the origin, which, well, there's a lot of things wrong with Scrum. If you wonder about it or want to hear more about it, let me know in the comments and I can add a video on that. But in defense of Scrum, there was never, like in the Scrum guide, anything that says you have to do story points. It's just talking about estimation in general and doesn't claim to know how to do it in the right way. But still, scrum.org has a blog post up in favor of story points. And you can see here that they reason because they are accurate, and that is claimed by Jeff Sutherland. Just if you look closer, that was like 2010, and the very same Jeff Sutherland in 2018 went 180 on this whole thing and posted that, well, you shouldn't actually estimate. Estimates are slowing you down. Just don't do it. And he's not the only prominent figure like that in the history of these story points. Ron Jeffries, who is a co-inventor of extreme programming, a co-author of the Agile Manifesto, very prominent person in our field. He also came back in his blog post on revisiting the story points, where he actually said, I'm sorry now, it's not a good idea at all. And both in the end argue against this whole estimation thing. And we covered a little bit of that in a previous video that you might be interested in. It's about Kinefin and why it's the basis on showing you how it is the underlying framework that is basically explaining why estimation is so problematic in software development. After looking at the history of these story points, let's start gathering these arguments. And if you like this kind of video, please let me know in the comments, like the video and subscribe to the channel if you want to have more like this. So, without further ado, let's get started on the first argument. The first argument against story points is that it takes time to come up with estimations. And that is a waste. It takes away time from development. And some people recommend to do this in different ways. We have like these things like planning poker, or you have to estimate with Fibonacci numbers like 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21 and so on. Or use t-shirt sizes, but even those can go to XXXXXL, whatever. Either way, you need to argue and you need to agree with a lot of people here. That takes time. And did you actually know that Vasco Duarte has gathered a lot of data and found out that it actually doesn't make a difference if you take all the time to estimate some story points, or if you just count the stories, which is essentially saying that each story is worth one story point, which obviously doesn't waste a lot of time, and the results have been the same. So links to his work are in the description. But in general, this is still a weak argument. It's essentially based on saying that the story point estimate in the end isn't adding a lot of value. And then of course, if it's not adding a lot of value, all the work you invest into providing that is waste. But what if it is? So kind of a weak one. So let's go to the second argument. And that is the story points are difficult in communication. So you have to communicate with stakeholders outside of your team, business people, subject matter experts, product owners, whatever they are called. But they usually don't understand your story points. Maybe don't even understand the concept as a whole. And they're also very used to dealing with traditional scales like money and time. And so you have a little bit of trouble communicating, but they are clever people too. So eventually they will learn how to map your story point speech to their world of time and money. But that's kind of arbitrary and misleading again. So you waste a lot of time then again to explain that they shouldn't map one story point to one day and similar discussions. And this argument is slightly stronger, as there is a waste involved. Even if you accept value in the estimate itself, you would need to communicate this in some way, which will lead to these problems of waste. Let's continue with the third argument against story points, and that is that story points are designed to be unique for each team. Each team, on their own, comes up with what they think is worth a 3 story point work. And for one team, 3 story points might be a day or an hour, and for another team it might be half a sprint. So you have a lack of consistency across teams when you look at these story points, although they are just numbers which look easily comparable. This kind of danger is always present there once you bring in story points from multiple teams. That limits the scalability of the whole approach. If you have to do planning across many teams on these different scales, it doesn't work very well to combine these measures. It's like comparing apples to bananas. And again, if you think back to Vasco Duarte, you could just count the stories that each team has to do, for example. And that would be much more comparable, and much more of a fair comparison as well. But why now is that actually harmful? The harm comes from this lack of inconsistency going unnoticed, and implicit assumptions being made but not spoken of. And that will in the end lead to a lot of stress and misunderstandings. You can imagine scenarios in which a team delivers 10 story points, and so why shouldn't the other team do as well? So this is the same thing happening on a grander scale. If you have multiple teams, it's just a lot of consistency problems that are not getting noticed, where people are making assumptions that are not justified on the basis of these completely incomparable scales. But again, this is a really strong argument, except for it's a potentially limited argument. To really bring up that argument, you need multiple teams. If there is only one team you're working with on this product, then there is no inconsistency to how they judge the story points versus other teams. And now the fourth argument is the problem that once you define these story points, teams will be measured on them. There's even a term for that which we call velocity, the number of story points a team realizes in one sprint. There's the same kind of scalability problem involved in there. Imagine a team A and they do 5 story points per sprint. And then you see team B in the same time period in the same sprint, and they actually do 50 story points. Now that looks so much better, except that the scales are not even comparable. But by nature, we take these numbers and start evaluating them, interpreting them, and we can't avoid this kind of thinking in our head without a lot of effort. And once you start this measurement and you try the effort even to try to align these story points between the teams, which is like really hard to do, but now you try as a team to maximize your velocity in a sprint, because that is what you're evaluated against. And what happens now is the actual harm in a big way. Now you get a psychological effect that is called the goal displacement effect, where we actually wanted to have this goal of great outcomes. We now shifted this and displaced this goal with a new one for the teams to maximize the velocity. And those are 2 different goals. So the teams will take completely different approaches. And in fact, you will get a lot of problems and a lot of harm from this. Because it's even getting worse when you realize that the team itself is giving you these story point estimates. So you're measuring them on something that they effectively control. And that means if you are in a struggle of having to do a high velocity thing, well, you just take an easy story and give it a lot more story points. It's up to you to find out the range you can go there without raising suspicions, but that's the basic game and it's so easy to play. Just make it look more complicated and oh, lo and behold, your velocity is increasing. Like nothing changed in reality except for a completely meaningless metric. And so this fourth argument is really the strongest argument we have. We assign the number and so we measure it. And once we measure it, we have to interpret it, and it becomes a goal, and we have this really strong risk of a harmful goal displacement effect coming into play. As mentioned in the beginning of this video, after seeing all these problems, we now need a solution. What are we going to replace story points with? How else do we work now? I know at least what I'm doing for this, but I don't want you to trust my opinion on this. Instead, let us look at what the experts are recommending. And if you remember our previous experts, they just so happen to agree on this. They all support the no estimates movement. Jeff Sutherland, when he revoked story points, said about estimations literally, don't do it. Ron Jeffries had a separate blog post just on no estimates, essentially saying, this is a great idea. And what about Vasco Duarte? Well, he even wrote the book on it. So what's your solution to the story point problems? Let me know in the comments below. Have you stopped estimating? Or are you skeptical about it? If so, I'd like to hear your reasons. Thank you very much for watching, and have fun developing.